Welcome to lesson 12.4, completing the square. So the first thing you want to keep in mind is that completing the square is just another method to solving quadratic equations. And at the end of this lesson, there will be an extra note about looking at a table in your book that goes over the best time to use the different approaches to solving quadratic equations. Now, remember, a quadratic equation is just an equation written as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So, in this method of completing the square, we have 6 steps to follow. The setup of the equation, you want to set it up as x squared plus bx plus, and we'll get to this part in pink. So for now, look at it as plus nothing equals c. In other words, you want to get the value of c to the other side. So the part in pink comes from step 2. That's the idea of taking half of b and squaring it. Then you add that to both sides. So as I put here, eventually it becomes x squared plus bx plus half of b squared, so b divided by 2 to the second power, equals c plus b divided by 2 to the second power. So this setup here will be the main setup we'll be using. Then you want to write the left side of the equation as a perfect square, which we'll go over again, and then combine the terms on the right side. You square root both sides. Don't forget that on the right, the answer would be a positive or negative, because that's what a square root can equal, and then we'll solve. So we are going to look at 4 different examples of how to go through this process of completing the square. So if we look at example A, we have x squared plus 10x minus 24 equals 0. So the first thing I want to do, looking at step 1 from before, is I want to get c to the other side. So my c here is after the minus 24, so I need to add 24 to each side. Then I'm written in that form of x squared plus bx equals c. So I can identify my parts. A in this case is 1, whatever's in front of the x squared. B is what's attached to the x, so b is 10, and c is the 24. So what we want to figure out is what is half of b squared. So we're going to take, to figure out half of b squared, if b was 10, 10 divided by 2 squared is the same thing as 5 squared, or 25. So when we plug this in, we are going to take that value, the half of b squared, and add it to each side. So our left-hand side becomes x squared plus 10x plus 25 equals, and the right-hand side becomes 24 plus 25. So the right-hand side, 24 plus 25 is 49. The left-hand side, what we want to look at is how can we write this trinomial as a perfect square binomial? Well, x squared plus 10x plus 25 is the same thing as x plus 5 times x plus 5, or writing it as a perfect square, x plus 5 squared. Because then if we would FOIL that, it would become x squared plus 10x plus 25. So when it says write the left side of the equation as a perfect square, we're always going to have a perfect square trinomial that we can write as a binomial to the second power. Then we have to square root both sides. So the square root of x plus 5 squared is just x plus 5. And the square root of 49 is positive or negative 7. So that's this symbol here, positive or negative. So in order to solve, we have to set it up as two equations. We have to set it up as x plus 5 equals 7 or x plus 5 equals negative 7. Then subtract 5 to solve for x, and x equals 2 or x equals negative 12. So example B, C is already on its own on the right. So in this case, we don't have to rearrange, and we just have A is 1, B is 2, and C is 35. So right away, I want to figure out what is half of B squared. Well, 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. So what I need to do is take that and add it to each side. So my equation becomes x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 36. Now, writing the left as a perfect square, it becomes x plus 1 squared. So x plus 1 squared equals 36. Square root each side, and x plus 1 equals a positive or negative 36. Then we have to split it to two equations to solve. So x plus 1 equals 36, or x plus 1 equals negative 36. Subtract 1 from each side, and x equals 35, or x equals a negative 37. Then we have examples C and D. So in C, we have x squared minus 8x plus 2 equals 0. We need to get that 2 to the other side, so we have to subtract 2 from each side. So the equation we're going to use is x squared minus 8x equals negative 2. So A equals 1, B equals negative 8, and C equals negative 2. So figuring out half of B squared, we have negative 8 divided by 2 squared. So negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. So we're going to add 16 to both sides, and we end up with x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals a negative 2 plus 16. Writing the left as a perfect square, that would be, and I miswrote here, that should just be an x. So it should be x minus 4 to the second power equals 14. So again, that should be x minus 4 to the second power equals 14, not x squared in there. Square root each side, and we end up with x minus 4 equals a positive or negative square root of 14. Then we have to split it to our two setups. So x minus 4 equals 14, and then x minus 4 equals the negative square root of 14. So in this case, to solve for x, we're adding 4 to each side. Now, if the directions say leave your answer in simplest form, our two answers would just be x equals 4 plus square root of 14, or x equals 4 minus square root of 14. If they want the answer as a decimal, then you just plug this into your calculator, and x is approximately 7.74, or x is approximately 0.26. Then our final example, example D, we have x squared minus x minus 3 equals 0. So the first thing we have to do is add that 3 to each side, and we have x squared minus x equals 3. So then A is 1, B is a negative 1, and C is 3. So what I notice right away is B is an odd number. In all my other examples, B was an even number. Completing the square works when B is an odd number, but it is not the quickest or best approach. So again, at the end of this, we'll talk about a table in your book that you'll want to look at, and that covers when to use which approach and which is the best. So in this case, we can use completing the square, which you'll see, but it's not as clean as it was on some previous examples. So in D, we have x squared minus x equals 3. In figuring out the half of b squared, well, we have a negative 1 over 2 squared, which would be a negative half times a negative half, which equals 1/4. So we are going to add 1/4 to each side. So adding 1/4 to the left, we end up with x squared minus x plus 1/4. On the right, 3 plus 1/4, I wanted to leave it as a fraction, so that is the same thing as 13 over 4. The reason I left it as a fraction here is it makes it a lot easier to write a simplified answer and to keep your work clean. So I would not convert anything to a decimal until the very last step. So then we have to write the left as a perfect square binomial. So because the middle is a negative here, I know it's a minus here. So x minus 1/2 squared equals 13 over 4. Square root each side, and then x minus 1/2 equals a positive or negative square root of 13 over 2. Simplified version of square root of 13 over 4. Then, in order to solve for x, we have to write our two equations of x minus 2 equals square root of 13 over 2, or x minus 1/2 equals negative square root of 13 over 2. So we're adding 1/2 to each side, so our simplified form answers, x would equal 1/2 plus the square root of 13 over 2, or x would equal 1/2 minus the square root of 13 over 2. Or if they wanted decimal answers, that's when you plug it into your calculator, and we get approximately 2.30, or approximately negative 1.30. So there's a table in your book on page 732 that's titled Methods for Solving Quadratic Equations. Some of your practice problems in part 1 and part 2 will ask which method would you use to solve the quadratic and why. What you'll want to do is look at that table and look back at some of your previous notes on solving quadratic equations if you still have previous notes packets. Otherwise, they are still in Google Classroom, and the table in your book tells you which page or which lesson numbers to look back at if need be. So use that table in your book to help you with the practice problems that ask about which method. And for completing the square, again, make sure that you're showing your work, showing your setup and process, so that if you are making mistakes and you need help, I can see where you're going wrong and what specifically you need help with.